Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology, and this is another episode of Planets in Profile. So in this episode, I'm going to be taking a look at the planet Mars and the sign of Taurus. If you're new to this series, I've been doing this for a while. Right now, I'm only tracking Mars and Venus through the 12 signs, giving you a little profile of Mars and Venus in each sign. And then eventually I'll move on to looking at the other planets. But anyway, this one we're looking at Mars and Taurus, which has just recently entered Taurus in February of 2019. So let's go ahead and take a look. Mars in the sign of Taurus. Again, I've said this in every episode. I'm going to repeat it in this one. If you want to understand a planet in any sign, you have to start by understanding whose house is it in. So when Mars is in the sign of Taurus, it's in Venus's home. It is a house guest in the land or home or temple of Venus. And so as such, bound by the rules of the guest-host relationship, which is very formal, Venus must provide for Mars. What does Mars want? Well, Mars is the god of war. So Mars wants things like violence, hunting, aggression, courage, valor, confrontation, blood, right? Guns and knives, but also maybe chemistry and math and things that divide or cut. So Mars has its own character, its own needs. How does Mars get his needs met, so to speak, when he's hanging out in Venus's home? Well, Venus is going to have to provide, and she can't provide through anything but her own nature and whatever her situation is in the sky or in a birth chart. So you always have to look at that relationship very carefully to get a sense of exactly what Mars is going to be doing. If Mars is in Taurus, where is Venus? What is she up to? What's her situation? Is she in a good house or a bad house? Is she in a good sign, exalted, in detriment? What's her situation? Does she have a healthy aspect to Mars, or is she an aversion to Mars, or does she have an opposition to Mars, or whatever the case might be? Knowing that, you can start putting the puzzle together. So in some ways, you can't really interpret a planet in a vacuum. It's just not what astrology was ever designed to do. However, hopefully, just knowing that you have to look at Venus's condition, that you have to get some sense of Mars in relation to Venus when Mars is in Taurus, you will be better equipped to make a more sophisticated interpretation when you're practicing. So Taurus is a solid, fixed sign, comes in the middle of spring. It's earthy, it's feminine. It's a domicile of Venus, and it's the exaltation of the moon. So it's a pretty feminine hangout spot for both Venus and the moon. Now, it struggles to express itself naturally in Venus's sign. It's said to be in its detriment or its exile here because it's in the opposite sign of its own domicile. So Mars rules Scorpio, its opposite sign is Taurus. When it's in its opposite sign, it's in its exile. It's like being in a foreign country and not knowing the language. Or it's like being in a foreign country, it's harder to move around when it's not your natural environment. Similarly, Mars in Aries, in its exile or detriment in Libra, the opposite sign, Venus ruled. Same thing with Venus. If you take Venus from Libra, put it into Aries, she's in her exile. If you take Venus from Taurus, put her in Scorpio, she's in her exile. Venus and Mars are adulterous lovers. You know, they have a forbidden relationship because we're talking about the god of war and the god of love. And so they have a complex relationship. Of course, there is a kind of yin-yang element to their relationship that is dynamic, creative, that's a part of sexual union and tension. But there's also strife between the two of them. There's also something forbidden. We're not supposed to admit that we love war, you know? But think very quickly about what most people turn on the news to see every day. Conflict. People like conflict. People love conflict. That's the marriage between Venus and Mars. On the other hand, the warrior desires the state of peace. Why am I fighting? Well, for peace. Why am I fighting? Well, for victory. Well, what does victory bring with it? Enjoyment, pleasure, reward, cheer, a sense of being appreciated and admired brings Venus. Warriors are dressed in the costumes of Venus. Warriors wear uniforms that are beautiful, right? There's something beautiful and orderly about battle. The uniforms of the football players. I don't probably not trying to, some people will be like, no, you're not selling me. But think about it in the other sense. Think about a ballet, the dancers. Yes, they're they're dressed beautifully or whatever, but like, look at their muscles, right? So amazingly how strong they are. There's something, right? Strong and bold. So Mars and Venus have this intricate relationship with one another. It's not to say that, oh, well, Mars just hates Venus, or, Venus just hates Mars. But what we do need to understand is that Mars is having his needs addressed by Venus in Taurus, and that's difficult. It's difficult to go to battle when someone, like, you're like, I want to go to battle, and Venus in Taurus is like, well, what about baking an apple pie and like going for a bike ride in the country, something like that. And that's just difficult for Mars and Taurus. So one of the things that you'll see is the tension between the aggression, the will, the domineering qualities of Mars, and the more peaceful Venusian qualities of Taurus. This can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. For example, sometimes you'll see cases quite literally in a birth chart where Mars and Taurus may have something to do with difficulties, violence, power struggles within relationships, because you're talking about some tendency for Mars to be conflicted within the realm of Venus. Sometimes it's difficulty in terms, it's a difficulty around expressing your will. You want to be strong, but you keep feeling an inertia, a sense of passivity, or you don't want to cause a fuss. So sometimes, Mars and Taurus will find a way of trying to control things and get their way while also trying to make everyone happy or content. It might be a great sign for someone who has to manage a big project or a lot of people, where there's a need to create larger harmony, but to have an executive function at the same time. It could be great in terms of being able to get work done, productive, industrious, earthy, in a way that's controlled, patient, conservative, balanced, pleasing. But again, you could see Mars in Taurus struggling with the exact same elements. The element of motivation, the element of inertia, the sense of wanting to control or be more domineering, and really struggling with that quality. So oftentimes you'll have, for example, people with Mars and Taurus are, they'll struggle to kind of own their power. They'll have a hard time riding the line between being sort of domineering and a likable leader, something like that. Conflicts with authority, inability to be liked by others through the expression of your will. If you're everyone has to express or exert their will, and sometimes there's just a way that you'll have, if you're Mars and Taurus, or just you express your will, and for whatever reason it just rubs people the wrong way. Some of this again comes from a tendency toward passive aggression. That can be a Mars and Taurus kind of thing as well. So these are things you can think about in general with Mars in Venus's sign. For example, my grandfather had Mars in Taurus with Jupiter also. He was a domineering guy, really quite a bully at times, in fact, but kind of boastful and proud. But he was so industrious and hardworking and got a lot done. And he really struggled with wanting to be liked, but also being so good at what he knew he had to do to get something done and to make it look nice and be good, that he just also couldn't stand or couldn't tolerate having to deal with people who got in his way. So he was conflicted about how to wield his sort of executive power in the world. That's a Mars and Taurus kind of situation sometimes. All right, so that gives you some things to think about, again, with regard to Mars and Venus's sign. Hopefully that's given you enough examples to play with. Interestingly, Hitler had he was a Taurus sun, but also had Mars in Taurus. So I'm not trying to say that people who have Mars and Taurus are Hitler, but there is something bullish and really domineering, and sometimes the ability to be very powerful, but to also deceive people into believing that your exercise of control or power is a good thing. In other words, you could be someone who wields power and somehow it's attractive to others, even though it might be very selfish or, again, very like bullying or whatever. So another thing was that my grandfather attracted a lot of people who really looked up to him and really admired him. But it had to do with kind of some of his strongman thing. And just, he had a charm to the way that he used power. And so don't underestimate how attractive and alluring the Mars and Taurus can be, almost a little intoxicating, in fact. And you can see that a bit in the way that Hitler rose to power and ended up exerting so much power over his followers, and was obviously murderous as well. At any rate, not to say that he's alone either in terms of politicians in the world who do this. I'm not ignorant of the fact that there have been many, terrible tyrants or dictators throughout history. He's just a good example of the kind of conflictedness of Mars and Venus that you'll sometimes see with Mars and Taurus. The constellation of Taurus was called the Bull, and it was associated with fertility, but it was also associated with sacrificial offerings that brought the renewal of life. For example, sometimes bulls were slaughtered. But apparently, the constellation of the Bull, like other constellations, is really, really old. Like, it dates back to like 10 or 15,000 BCE, I read somewhere. And it used to be, because of the precession of the equinoxes, it used to be the constellation lined up with the spring equinox. So that's also interesting from the standpoint of its association with spring. And then the mythology was that when the sun moved into the sign of the bull, that it was sacrificing, that the sun was killing the bull. It was covering it up, killing it, and that from its blood would come the offering, so to speak, that would bring the renewal of spring. So, and if you know anything about star lore, Taurus has some of the most gnarly fixed stars in terms of like super malefic, difficult fixed stars. You got some of the Pleiades and the Algol, and especially the later degrees of Taurus. But there is a heavy dark side that's related to Taurus anyway. The renewal of life in the spring was a lusty a kind of time. And, now we think of that. Sometimes we think of Aries being like that. But Taurus, remember, is also a sign that's aspiring upward toward the summer solstice. It's fixed, it's earthy, it's feminine, but it's also yang in a more macrocosmic sense, because it's on the yang half of year. It's a feminine sign, but it's on the yang half of the year, and it's aspiring upward. And there's this sense of I want bullish. I want to get what I want at any cost. And on some level, it's deceptive that Venus is the ruler, because people think of Taurus and Venus, and again, they think of country bicycle rides, apple pie, and a blanket in the park. But that's not all there is to the sign of Taurus. There is a tremendous lust for power that can be a part of Taurus. And that's not, Venus is a part of that. Venus is also signifies part of worldly lust. And that's also part of the image of the feminine. Not that the masculine is, excused from that either, but it's one of the faces of the feminine that's part of Taurus. And also the idea of there being a certain warfare or lust. And so when Mars comes into Taurus, you also think about the more more of the bloodthirst of spring that's connected to fertility and sex and procreation and desire. And it's like all of that is fueled on a certain level by blood. Because in this world, of course, everything is turning over constantly. Everything's eating one another. So sometimes Mars in Taurus just brings out the more sort of the image of sacrifice, blood, desire, lust, power, that's also associated with the beauty and fertility of spring. And you'll see that sometimes come out more strongly when Mars is in Taurus. So I hope that this was informative and that you got something good out of this. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot them my way about this or about anything else at nightlightastrology@gmail.com. Just put YouTube Q&A in the question or in the subject line. Okay, you guys have a great journey with Mars and Taurus, and we'll catch up with you when Mars goes into Gemini. All right.